Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. My name is Johanna. I'm from the UN Innovation Network. Thanks for being with us today. We have recently, in the past month or so, been talking a lot about data. And as you know, the Secretary General launched a data strategy last year. It is called For Action by Everyone, Everywhere. And through this strategy, the SG really hopes to build a UN-wide data ecosystem that unlocks the potential of all of the UN's data and really use it to drive better decision making. And then a month ago or so, we had colleagues from the EOSG join us, and that's the Executive Office of the Secretary General, and they discussed the recent data, digital, and innovation mapping that they've done for the third year in a row. And this year, it had a particular focus on assessing existing data capabilities in the UN. So coming back to data there. And then 2 weeks ago, we had a webinar on advancing UN data quality and integration with our colleagues from the UN University. And we learned a lot there about challenges to collecting and managing, and particularly integrating data in this interagency UN context. Lots of challenges coming out there. I thought it was super interesting. And today we're going to continue on this data journey. And we will learn more about the Crisis Insights team. And that's a relatively new initiative, which the Secretary General recently established to support UN interagency work on advanced analytics and artificial intelligence for crisis response. So I think it was born out of COVID. You may not have heard about it yet, but there'll be lots and lots coming out of that. And I'm told lots of great insights that the team's ready to share. So as usual, we're going to have a short presentation up front, and then it'll be followed by Q&A. On the next slide, you can see that we use the Q&A feature on Zoom. It's at the bottom of your screen. You can put any questions in there that you'd like to ask our presenter in the second half of the webinar. And we really, really like it if you like people's questions. That helps us prioritize. It helps us make sure that what we're discussing in the second half remains relevant. So please do that as much as you can. And if you'd like to take the floor and ask the question yourself, leave your name. We'll call on you later on, or we'll try to do so as much as possible. I'd like to hit the most popular question out of the way first. And yes, the webinar is being recorded. The slides are going to be available. You can find it on the UN webinar library. And you can also find recordings of the webinars I just mentioned there as well. And now you've definitely heard enough from me, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to our presenter for the day, Chris Ernie. Good to see you. Until not long ago, Chris was the head of UNHCR's Innovation Service, and now he's heading up the Crisis Insights team. Chris, you have a lot to share on your journey getting to the Crisis Insights team. Really looking forward. You promised us very open and honest insights. So looking forward to what you have to say. Handing over to you.
Thanks, Joanna, and thanks everyone for your time and hopefully interest in this topic. My name's Chris, and I currently I'm seconded from the UN Refugee Agency to Global Pulse. Some of you will know what Global Pulse is, who Global Pulse is, and why Global Pulse exists. Essentially 10, 11 years ago, it was the previous UN Secretary General's initiative on big data, AI, and for development, humanitarian action, and so on and so forth. It's now kind of entering its second decade, and it's going through a bit of a change process, which is incredibly exciting. So watch this space. The whole team from Jakarta to Kampala, Finland, New York, and everyone working remotely in between or outside of those geographies is kind of very, very on board with kind of yet another iteration in Global Pulse's kind of journey. So watch this space. I'm sure we'll open up for kind of questions around what Global Pulse sort of heads towards at some point, but maybe not in this webinar. So this time last year, we had front row seats to the unfurling of COVID-19. At the time, I was actually seconded from UNHCR to the SG's office, and was asked to take a look with another colleague at the UN Operations and Crisis Center, which is kind of situational awareness body at the UN Secretariat, and it provides information and insights for decision making across many different levels of the UN. And I was here in New York helping them to think through some new approaches to situational awareness, perhaps looking at new data streams, access to new platforms or expertise or experiences or partners. And what we saw with the unfolding of COVID-19 was a range of more traditional approaches being used to understand this crisis, including some quite siloed approaches to understanding what was going on. And what sort of became clear to many people was that whilst this was a health emergency, the consequences, effects, and responses and plans for a plurality of futures needed to be understood as such. And so what we saw in Global Pulse was an emerging, initially quite vague set of needs and an emerging set of opportunities. And with the two of those, an emerging set of uncertainties around what wasn't possible, in terms of creating insights, in terms of understanding what was going on in the world related to COVID-19. And this ranged from access to data to the ethical uses of AI and machine learning. And so what we saw at the beginning of the crisis was there was a huge opportunity to use more data, to diversify the data sets that we had access to, and also to diversify the insights that were being provided to decision makers. But what we also found that we were somewhat hamstrung by needs versus opportunities versus uncertainties. And that's to say that rather than letting the perfect being the enemy of the good, we decided that we'd practice what we preach as innovators, and we'd take quite an experimental approach to a few different hypotheses. So rather than getting stuck on mandates and hierarchies, we occupied a space of experimentation. And we often find, I think, that even within our innovation space, including this network and beyond, is that sometimes we're not so comfortable in challenging our own assumptions or speaking about mistakes. But as we know in innovation, there are mistakes that are acceptable and there are mistakes that are not. So what we decided that we would do was that we thought we might have something to offer decision makers across the UN, from humanitarian actors at the field level through to strategic decision makers at headquarters. UN Global Pulse has always been able to reach across the range and depth of the UN and beyond, with existing tools, with expertise in data science, machine learning in particular, in forming partnerships, and also in creating processes with which to experiment, either finding new needs or finding new solutions to more established needs. So what we did in, when was it? May 2020, which seems like 50 years ago now, is that we threw together a team of secondments from different UN agencies, partners, namely from private sector, and existing team members within Global Pulse to carry out what ended up being a large-scale experiment around sense-making and creating insights for decision-making. And so what we began with was quite a rough and ready kind of process to understand what some of the needs might be from across our UN, so from WHO through to OHCHR through to UNDP. And based on the 4 trends that we started seeing emerging in terms of requests or interest in collaboration in that first few months, so sort of May, June, we identified 4 main areas that we wanted to experiment with. One was data and insights and analytics to support the health emergency. Secondly was fighting infodemics. And when we talk about infodemics, we're talking about potentially harmful disinformation or misinformation related to COVID-19. Thirdly, we wanted to understand the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 on our world, in particular on the most vulnerable people of it. And then the fourth thing that we wanted to do was to was to help prepare and plan for a plurality of futures. Now, as all being good innovators, we wanted to follow, although somewhat loosely, an innovation process. We knew that this was going to be an experiment. So what we did, whether we did it more consciously or not, and noting that we were in the midst of a crisis, was first of all, we identified some basic assumptions around what we thought we had to offer and what we thought we'd understood the needs to be. The second thing that we did was we sorted our hypotheses by relevance. So we looked at where we thought there were problems, what we thought the solution space might look like, and then what our hypothesis was for success. Whether the kind of the outcomes or the solutions were products or services or models, approaches or systems. And then the next thing that we started to do was to form some kinds of testable hypotheses in many different forms. We did not go through this in the most perfect of ways. But our testable hypotheses were largely based around the team's ability to support accelerated integration of strategic insights, real-time data analysis into decision-making for UN entities responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's kind of the spiel that we've got up on the website. So if you want to learn more than this talking head can offer, then definitely go to unglobalpulse.org. There's a whole page up on the Crisis Insights team in which you can find out a lot more beyond me talking. And really what we wanted to do was kind of avoid what we see within the UN and beyond, which is solutions being pushed before really investing in what we understand the problems to be. So two quotes often cited in our innovation circles. The first is from Henry Ford, that went something like, if I'd asked them what they needed, they would have said more horses. And the second quote that's also cited, also from a middle-aged white man, was from Albert Einstein, who said something along the lines of, if you asked me to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes understanding the problem and 5 minutes solving it. If we were to kind of transpose into our circumstance, I would argue that in our context, we should spend, as innovators in the UN, 55 minutes understanding the problem, probably about an hour to create an enabling environment, including educating managers on what it means to create spaces for innovation, fixing bureaucratic impediments to innovation. Then I'd spend about 4 minutes solving the problem and then spend a further minute sharing what worked and crucially, probably what didn't work. But that's just me. So when it comes to kind of the projects themselves, I'm going to talk you through four. If we have time, I might skip one of them so we can get on to the lessons learned, because I think that's probably quite interesting for this group. So under support to the health emergency, we were really interested in using the technology and approaches of the UK government to assist decision-making by public health professionals in the context of refugee hosting in Cox's Bazar. And so what we did was we built an approach to simulate the effects of different public health interventions against the spread of COVID-19 within that refugee hosting context. And so although we created this model for Cox's Bazar refugee settlement, the model is really designed for scale, and when I say scale in this instance, I mean it's generalizable to other settings. And so what we ended up doing was using a model that was used by the UK government, and then we were adapting it for adoption within the Cox's Bazar refugee settlement, which houses an expansion site and is essentially a collection of camps for refugees, which form the most densely populated and interconnected site, hosting around 600,000 Rohingya refugees. And so what we wanted to do was feed into decision-making with a number of organizations involved. So this was the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, the UN Refugee Agency, the World Health Organization, private sector, public sector actors, including the MIT, IBM, Watson AI Lab, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Durham University. So four examples of how this model was used by decision makers at the field level. One was we wanted to establish a baseline. So in doing so, we wanted to determine the effect that protective measures would have on the spread of COVID-19. So we simulated what the spread would look like with no interventions. The second thing was we simulated in regards home care of sick individuals. We simulated differences between treating all positive cases in treatment centers versus encouraging home isolation for certain cases. The third thing was we looked at mask wearing. So we simulated the effects of different levels of compliance with mask wearing on the spread of COVID-19 over time in the settlement. And then the fourth thing that we did was we looked at learning centers. So we explored the different possibilities for reopening learning centers, which are obviously vital to the community and which were closed in March 2020. So this is kind of field level. It's reaching across a range of UN entities, and it's really heading towards a specific set of questions that decision makers had. The second big bucket of work was around managing infodemics. And for this piece of work, we were looking at a problem space which was potentially harmful misconceptions or rumors related to protective measures that could guide communication strategies of national authorities. So we were really looking at misconceptions or rumors related to COVID-19, whether it was rumors of herbal cures, perhaps that were circulating, or rumors related to appropriate care of sick family members, for example, and so on and so forth. So what we ended up looking at were kind of two areas in terms of solution spaces. And let me preface this by saying this is also a collaboration across the UN between the World Health Organization and also the African Infodemic Response Alliance, which is also a kind of a collaboration between many other actors outside of the UN space, including IFRC, the CDC, WHO, AFRO, and also UNICEF, among others. And so what we wanted to do was provide insights to that alliance so that it would be able to respond to health misinformation within Africa specifically. And so what we were looking at in terms of the solution space was, first of all, disinformation monitoring using publicly available data on the internet to identify and analyze. So we used a private sector partnership using that organization's platform to make sense of the plethora of publicly available data and information that we didn't necessarily have the tools to dissect and understand around specific misinformation or disinformation events. And then secondly, what we wanted to be able to do was recognizing that, and so that first solution space is really tied to social media, largely Twitter data, but not everybody's on Twitter, of course. And particularly in the Africa region, there's also a diversity of platforms that we need to kind of better understand so that we can understand the discourse, we can understand the discussions related to COVID-19. And radio is one of those platforms that we worked out that we needed to better understand to kind of complement that first stream of work. So we've carried out a number of experiments around radio mining, also for infodemic management, so that we can create a scalable analytics platform based on AI, based on machine learning, based on data engineering that can extract public radio content as well, also in real time related to COVID-19 topics. Now, with both of these work streams, what ends up happening, particularly with the social media analysis, is every single week we know that there is a standard set of insights that we need to provide to our colleagues in WHO and then the African Infodemics Response Alliance, and so we create monitors within a private sector platform with a specific set of taxonomies, so that we can understand a regular we can have a regular understanding of what the various rumors are out there related to COVID-19. And then the second thing is we have an ad hoc kind of request that will come in from WHO and others. Perhaps there's a newly emerging rumor around topic X, Y, and Z that they really need the insights on as it emerges. So we also provide that service to WHO and ERA. Let me just say that all of these projects are kind of indicative, and there's an awful lot more going on, but I wanted these to kind of illustrate kind of that the kind of diverse kind of needs that we've seen emerge across the UN. So the first bucket of work was around support to the health emergency. The second bucket of work is around infodemics. The third big piece of work was around social and economic impact. I'm not going to dig into this one in too much detail because I'm wary of our time, but let's just say that there were a number of insights that we wanted to be able to we wanted to kind of create, particularly in terms of the human rights space and how that's changing in this crisis. And we wanted to be able to match the cadence of change, either in terms of the treatment of human rights or the perception of what is and what is not acceptable during this crisis. It's quite a sensitive area, and we'll come on to sensitivities a little bit later on. But essentially, we've been working with parts of the UN that use a human rights lens to understand how a kaleidoscope of rights are being affected by COVID-19, either in the way that artificial intelligence is being used to understand situational awareness, for example, or at the level of protection working groups in specific geographies, so that we can understand how the rights of perhaps more vulnerable groups are further being marginalized, and secondly, how this can be mitigated. The fourth large area of work that we've been looking at is futures and foresight. It's an emerging topic. It's something that, in particular, some public sector actors and some private sector actors have been using for at least a decade. And we're starting to see where there might be more value in applying foresight methodologies and processes. One in crises, but also as it emerges in terms of kind of our own programmatic direction as Global Pulse moving forwards. This is the newest part of our experiment with the Crisis Insights team, and for me, in many ways, it's really exciting. So what we wanted to do was build upon Global Pulse's experiences, particularly in the humanitarian sector, when it came to looking at futures in a number of ways, and the plurality of futures we might want to contribute to as a UN family. And so in the context and in the using the lens of COVID-19, we've carried out a number of experiments with, for example, UNHCR and other humanitarian actors to understand how we can use foresight in kind of planning for a plurality of futures. We're currently just starting to work with colleagues in the Secretary General's office and many other parts of our UN to work out how foresight can play a stronger role in how we plan for turbulence, a more turbulent future, and how we can kind of identify critical uncertainties, mitigating risk, and kind of head towards creating more desired futures. So what does this mean? It means building quantitative and qualitative processes for sense making. We want to use very diverse sets of data and people and organizations in understanding what reality looks like currently, and then really feeding these insights and the sense making into planning and preparation for futures. So what we did was kind of try to get this off the ground in the context of COVID-19, but it's in fact become a much bigger program, and kind of far more. There are far wider needs than simply this current pandemic. Maybe we can kind of open up for discussions around Foresight, because I'm also aware that there are lots of interested parties, and the approach that we're taking at Global Pulse is really to be very collaborative and open, and we have resources that we would like to share. Anyway, I've gone down a rabbit hole that I shouldn't have gone down. The next thing that I wanted to kind of briefly touch on is what did we learn from all of this? We've had a lot of successes, but we've also had a ton of failures. So the first kind of big lesson that we've learned from our experience over the last 8-9 months is that for us to be able to innovate in this crisis, and to innovate effectively moving forwards, is that investment in teams is vital, not investment in projects. Too often our competition, and I would argue our misunderstandings of problem spaces, sometimes on the side of donors actually, force us to run after project funding with really discrete needs that can take us off track, and take us away from really truly understanding the problems that we're trying to solve. In this instance, in the middle of this crisis, we found that a new type of relationship with donors, one that's based on values of transparency and humility, allowed us to make use of flexible funding and investments in a Global Pulse team and network, rather than specific outputs and solutions. So this allowed us to approach problems and therefore outcomes. So WHO invested in the Crisis Insights team with such an approach. So did the government of Sweden, Canada, and more recently Finland. And our relationships with these donors is much more transparent than we might otherwise have had in the past. So investment in teams, not projects, one key takeaway. And the second thing was that we found that the cadence of this crisis, as well as the cadence of demand for more information, for data, for platforms, problem solving, partnerships, funding, really stress tested the Global Pulse team. And so we're based in Jakarta and Kampala, Helsinki and New York, and increasingly operate as a kind of networked model. But we've got a group of extremely smart people, but despite the will and the ideas, potential solutions, technologies, we're constantly hampered by design, and part of that design is of the bureaucracy itself and the bureaucracy of our UN. Don't get me wrong. Bureaucracy is our friend. It can protect and it can guide, but it can also hamper and get in the way of progress if we're not careful. So when it comes to legal agreements, when it comes to processing funding from donors, when it comes to the ability to hire in new profiles, diverse profiles that we're not necessarily accustomed to as a UN, we needed to there's a whole bureaucracy that also needs to keep up with our ability to kind of innovate. So in this respect, I would suggest two things. One, that we keep track of the many bureaucratic hurdles and opportunities, and really take the time to truly understand why those hurdles exist. What's the spirit of their original design? And secondly, to help overcome them. I think too often we focus on the product innovations, the gadgets and the apps, when in actual fact there's a wealth of innovators or wannabe innovators who are operating in some of the most kind of prosaic spaces of our bureaucracy, who also need supporting and innovating, which also helps us to innovate more. Third, a long way to go in creating spaces of innovation. Management who don't necessarily understand the empowering role that they can play in creating an enabling environment, and also in terms of education and capacity. We can dig into this in more detail in a bit. And then the last set of lessons learned is really around unintended consequences. And I think that with emerging teams and emerging needs, whether we're talking about people with skills in artificial intelligence or machine learning or behavioral science, futures, foresight, digital transformation, we also have a lot more that we need to do, and a lot more we need to handle with great care with regards to people's mental health. I think that this crisis has shown us, lots of people being exposed and immersed in an emergency or a crisis who suddenly found themselves in the thick of it, from the physical safety of their living rooms or kitchens, or in some cases bedrooms. For me, I kind of found the isolation pretty loud at times, and whilst I'm a humanitarian who's worked in a number of conflict zones, I found that my own mental health in dealing with this crisis and the wealth of data, often much of it negative, certainly took its toll in kind of my own outlook and my own spirit, I suppose. So I would say that as managers of innovation teams, if we're responding to this crisis or others, when we're bringing people in from perhaps non-traditional profiles, we also have a much stronger role to play in kind of care and attention for people's mental health. I've probably missed a load of direct messages from Joanna telling me to be quiet, or that I've forgotten to answer poll questions. So I'm probably gonna be quiet at this point, and maybe hand over to you, Joanna, to kind of take us through the next part of the webinar. And I've definitely gone over, so sorry for that.
Thank you, Chris. And I would never bombard you with lots of questions. Thank you for the great presentation and for the introduction to the team. Lots of work. I have no idea how you guys managed to pull it off last year. I imagine there were a lot of long evenings to get all of this running. Colleagues, we're going to take questions that you have put into the Q&A box. So once again, I want to encourage you to vote on questions that are of interest to you. And if you leave your name, we'll try and call on you later so you can ask the question yourself. So Chris, now that you had a sip of water and a moment to relax, let me give you the first question. And colleagues are wondering, how does the team actually work? Do they approach you with a problem that they want to solve? Do you identify an area that you want to work on and then you kind of look around for partners? What's the model?
The quick answer is yes to all of those things. I mean, look, it's a mixture. So with we have a whole people approach us on a regular basis with ideas or hypotheses they want to test or experiments they want to kind of move forwards with, and it's very kind of rough and ready triage at the moment in terms of what we can take on and what we can't. So we try and look as much as possible at impact or potential impact of the problems we're trying to solve. And yeah, and there's a whole really important stream of work that that I think we're all invested in, which is around discovery. And working out what is possible with emerging or new tools, and so there is a certain amount that is around discovery, which I don't want to conflate with opportunism, but we also have a stream of work which is about testing out new and emerging technologies and approaches, noting of course that we shouldn't be conflating innovation with technology alone. Over.
Very important message. Thank you for emphasizing that. And great to hear. So the next question, I'll take another anonymous one, and then we go to Gavin from UNICEF. But first of all, I'd like to know, what is the difference between the Crisis Insights team and other maybe data initiatives that we're seeing in the UN? And the colleague here is mentioning OCHA's data center. I think that's the Center for Humanitarian Data based in The Hague. So how are you positioned vis-a-vis them? Are you collaborating? Are you in the same space?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're all in the same space because we're trying to solve big problems for the world. I think the universal truth is that we don't have enough innovation efforts. I don't think we have enough data efforts. I certainly don't think we've got enough in terms of investments in artificial intelligence or machine learning or data science. So what we've been trying to do is make use of where we sit in the UN. So Global Pulse is part of the Executive Office of the Secretary General, and so there's a huge amount of convening that we can and should do. So Global Pulse has always been able to reach across the length and breadth of the UN. They've it's worked with development, through to humanitarian, through to human rights, through to peace and security, and that's something it's only going to continue to do. So with, for example, OCHA and their amazing efforts in The Hague, yeah, ongoing consultation, exchanges of ideas, exchanges of what has worked and what hasn't worked, with data science efforts in UNHCR, an awful lot of really intimate and integrated work. Same with OHCHR, and so really our approach is to be collaborative, to provide value add where we can, and certainly not to kind of tread on toes or whatever, but also our role is to kind of push the envelope in ways that other bits of the UN perhaps can't, because they don't necessarily have the capacities or exposure to some of the partners that Global Pulse has. So we're here to do experimentation. We're here to look at data science, and increasingly kind of step into futures in Foresight and other areas of the quintet of transformation that I think Kirsten will have briefed this group on as well. Over.
Thank you. An ambitious agenda you have there: collaborating, convening, pushing envelopes, experimenting. Very nice. For everyone who's not familiar with the quintet, that includes data, digital, innovation, future literacy, and behavioral science. And I think we can expect a lot of momentum in all of these spaces in the coming months and years. Gavin from UNICEF, I am giving you the floor to ask the question that you put in the chat yourself.
Great, thank you. I realize now being anonymous has its advantages, so I have to speak. So
but
thank you so much.
But it's so much nicer coming online, so thanks for being brave.
No, thank you so much, and thanks, Chris. I'm with the Office of Research. I was formerly with UNICEF's Office of Emergency Programs. You talked about sense making, and that really very interesting thing to dig into. So I just wondered, maybe just quickly, given that we have a lot of holes in our data and evidence, I was interested to know how, on the sense making, how you went about it. Do you convene? If so, how do you knowledge share in those convenings? Because or to say, we can do a lot of number crunching, we can do a lot of analysis on quantitative explicit data, but that sense making, I think, is really where the humanitarian space is lacking, because it informs response plans and all sorts of things, and so it's a very exciting area. So quickly, if you could answer, and maybe I'd love to know more beyond this webinar. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely butcher the answer to this one, so reach out bilaterally. But look, I think the thing that we found is on sense making, the value of convening diversity, and so often I feel. No, often I know that we, a lot of that we're not connected enough to one, the decision-making bodies, but two, kind of a much broader constituent. And so I feel like a lot of this kind of innovation space and the data space within the UN is kind of driven by really passionate, really committed and professionals in these areas. And I think that our understandings of the kind of the analytics and the analysis always need to be complemented by people who don't operate in the data space. So for example, when we've worked with resident coordinators offices in different parts of the world, what I've seen is country teams and representatives of country teams from a kind of a diversity of hierarchies and functions being pulled together to look at data, to make sense out of it, and then kind of to build that into decision making. So really stepping away from like the data folks and the innovation folks, which also unfortunately have quite a strong set of demographics attached to them, and so trying to take bias out of that sense making and therefore out of decision making is something that we're kind of experimenting with at the moment, but I don't have a kind of a this is the right way to do it, because I don't think there is one right way. Over.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to Gavin for the question. Chris, I have two questions for you around scaling the effort and around expanding it. So a colleague is wondering, is there any plan to expand to provide insights to future or potential crises, and how can UN Secretariat departments tap into these insights for their work? And related to that, how will you scale for other crises?
Yeah, look, this was one big experiment. So there were a bunch of assumptions we were testing, and I think that increasingly it looks like this will be a standing capacity. Now, whether it exists within Global Pulse or within another more relevant or competent entity within the UN, that remains to be seen. But I do think that the team, and really I must take my hat off to the team, because they're the people driving this. It's certainly not this old white dude, but it's I think the team has really made some real successes and some real inroads, and really demonstrated what can be done using collaboration and partnership across the UN. So it will go somewhere else. It will be some kind of standing capacity. I don't know whether it would exist wholly within Global Pulse or somewhere else moving forwards. Secondly, so that would be in regards other emerging crises. And so we must always be experimenting around crises response and so on and so forth in the most ethical and moral ways possible. But the second thing is just around scale. And this is a word that I hate. For many, many different reasons. First of all, because I think it's just loaded with so many different understandings. Are we talking about replication, duplication, adoption, diffusion, scaling in, scaling up, scaling out? Like a lot of the time, I think that people are talking about replicating one thing many times, or replicating one approach in many geographies or across time zones or organizations. In regards to this one, Global Pulse isn't the organization that would probably be best placed to take something like this to scale in the many understandings of what that should look like. But it's certainly a good organization that can position this approach for scale, and can share the lessons learnt, and can really walk the talk, and kind of share what has worked and what hasn't worked. So there's a whole cultural element and kind of approach that we tried to instill in this approach that goes beyond products and services. And I think that that's really more important. How we can take some of those cultural elements and approaches to experimentation, and take some of those values around transparency and humility, and kind of share those more broadly. When it comes to the insights from this team, I think, hang on, email addresses and contact details are here. So I would encourage you to reach out to either my email address here, or there's probably a better address, which is cit@unglobalpulse.org, and reach out for kind of questions and or collaboration. Sorry, I'm doing so much talking. I should be quiet.
No. That's why I invited you, Chris, so you can do the talking. I'm taking this opportunity to say that we already put the email address in the chat, so it's in there. We'll repost it, and even more importantly, taking this opportunity to say thank you to Felicia, who is one of the team members, doing fantastic work behind the scenes. So it really is a team effort. Thanks for highlighting that, Chris. We've talked about scaling. Let's take a step back and take Luis's question from the World Bank. Luis, you are able to speak if you would like to ask the question yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. Very, very interesting. And congratulations for all this. I think it's a very exciting line of work. I wonder if you can give us some sort of flavor of some of the results and achievement that you guys have so far. I mean, I think you were somehow quite clear on some of the streams of work that you guys have been doing, but I mean, I would like to get a flavor of some of the actual impacts that you have with these kind of initiatives, just to get some inspiration. Over.
Yeah, unfortunately, they don't wheel me out to provide the inspiration. They more kind of wheel me out to talk frameworks and approaches. Look, I think one of the biggest successes for me anyway, and I come with my own biases as a humanitarian. I think the work that the team have carried out around infodemics is a huge success. And when I say the team, I really mean the Global Pulse team and those that they support within WHO. There was a real danger at the beginning of this pandemic that the infodemics efforts didn't get the attention that they perhaps should have done. So I think the variety of leaders across the UN kind of called out infodemics as an issue, and then very quickly rallied to make sure that the pathway was clear for new approaches to tackling infodemics, but also crucially that the money was there. The WHO's Solidarity Fund has been a great kind of fueler of Global Pulse's efforts, at least, and so being able to kind of rally the resources and the rhetoric to respond to the cadence of a really newly emerging trend, for me is a huge success. And the second big one for me was really that work in Cox's Bazar. And so Joe and Catherine and Miguel and many others in the team really were very fast to identify a problem and identify a set of lessons learned from one of our member states, and to kind of apply that to decision making very quickly in that context. Now I think that when they they do a lot of lessons learned and sharing with OCHA and with others around this epidemiological modelling. So I think that the approach is a great success, but I also think that the spirit within which the team has approached the challenge solving, and one that's been very open, very transparent, and very collaborative is something that blows me away. And I think it's quite unusual to see. And I mean, we will see more of this within our UN as the world gets increasingly more complex and complicated and turbulent. But so for me, it was those two efforts really stand out because of the spirit with which the teams have kind of approached the challenges. I'm not sure if that answered the question or not, but it's when I heard the question, these were things that resonated with me. Over.
Thanks for sharing, Chris, and thanks for the question to Luis from the World Bank. One of my favorite parts of webinars is when questions kind of naturally link, and this is the case here. I'm handing over to Jean-Martin from WFP in New York. Jean-Martin, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Chris, Joanna. I was wondering about data sharing. This is all super interesting work. The data is valuable for everyone, and I'm wondering how that comes back to the community after it's gone through the crisis team. Thank you.
Yeah, no, look, I think we have a bias towards sharing, and we have a bias towards sharing in the best possible ethical and moral, with the best possible. I'm getting tongue tied. I've been talking far too much today. Yeah, so we need to have a bias towards sharing, but that needs to be done within the right ethical and moral frameworks. So it's also something that Mila and Caroline and others within the Global Pulse team work on extremely hard. I will obviously butcher the answer to this one because I'm not an expert in what data sharing should look like. But let me just say that we want to share as much as we can. There are some impediments to doing that. One, where there are political sensitivities, so maybe the topic of an inquiry or question is just something that we can't make public. Maybe it's related to human rights, for example. Maybe there's a specific individual involved that we don't want to kind of pass. We don't want to appear to be passing judgment on publicly. But then there's also issues around triangulation of data and vulnerable groups, particularly when it comes to refugees and IDPs, stateless people, etc. So I think what I'd urge people to do is, if there are more questions on this, then we can set up a call with probably with Miguel and probably Mila once she's back. She's been on leave for a little bit, but she'll be back in a few weeks.
Thank you, Chris. And for everyone who's not familiar, Miguel, I believe, is the chief scientist at Global Pulse, and Mila is the data privacy officer, an expert on all things data. Really, really wonderful. Heading over to Mark Liberati from UNV. Mark, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And at UNV, I mean, we often are trying to mobilize very quickly our volunteers for crises, as we are a common service provider to the whole UN system. And so we were having this sort of discussion around our data insights, especially as we're moving towards a more automated and AI-driven recruitment process system. And I was thinking about, in a prior time in my life when I was working in logistics, and one of the things we had to always procure was war risk insurance. And especially to the comment of World Food Program, of how they've been very successfully retrofitting finance, predictive analytic tools that were used for trading, corn futures, and on the market, we're able to now predict famine and looking at how that's connected to conflict. And I was just wondering how your office is utilizing those finance tools and that innovation that's occurring in the private sector around war risk insurance, and then looking at that and how we can configure it for providing insights, especially in the peace and security architecture, when risks are increasing for conflict, and then how that would be institutionalized so that the system can then really prepare itself fully as those risks are increasing, and then also looking at mitigating measures. Thank you. Over.
I don't know. I mean, it sounds like you've got a whole solution worked out there. I'm not smart enough to answer your question, I'm afraid. What I would say is that just around, I do think that a lot of that seemed to resonate with at least my kind of understanding of what's possible and what's not. But what I would say, particularly, and you'd mentioned human resources as well, is that there's, and I do think that, I was a UNV back in Darfur many years ago, and I do think that, around managing rosters or anticipating intake or future kind of profile needs and so on and so forth, there's a lot more innovation that can be done there. UNHCR's innovation service has carried out an awful lot of work using AI and machine learning to take bias out of recruitment processes, specifically related to information management, data management. And so there's a whole bunch of work there which is not related to your question in any way, shape or form. But I think that I think it would just be great if UNV were talking to UNHCR about some of these HR aspects as well. But what I would say, I have my colleague Joseph, who is also on this webinar, and is far more intelligent than me, has just messaged me saying, if relevant on this question, then we could highlight that UNISAT has a collaboration for this area, plus the UN Operations and Crisis Center, plus we're in discussion with OCHA about anticipatory action for disease spread and other projects. So,
Chris, I'm happy to give Joseph the floor as well if you want to bring him in.
If you could, that would be fantastic.
Of course. Joseph, welcome to the conversation.
Hi, thank you very much. Sorry, yes, that was a brief message to Chris. That was useful. So I think it's a really interesting question. We've talked a lot about with some other partners around incorporating risk analysis into some of the projects we're working on. So I'm one of the researchers at Global Pulse, just for background, and working on the EPI modeling project that Chris talked about. So just a couple of other projects that we're talking about with partners. One is, as Chris mentioned, we've had a long-standing partnership with UNISAT, the UN Satellite Operations Program, who've been doing a lot of both crisis response and anticipatory action, sort of trying to analyze situations in pre and post-conflict, as well as natural disasters, anticipating them and responding to them. So we're in ongoing conversations around how we can better improve the use of AI, machine learning, and other innovation techniques in some of their work. I know from what Chris has mentioned, we're in ongoing discussions around collaborations with UNOCC in the crisis response more generally, and also trying to take parts in some of OCHA's conversations around anticipatory action. So this is definitely an area where we're going into. But yes, any other ideas you have from the integration of risk into some of these projects will be really interesting to hear about. So also if you want to reach out. I also see Lars is on the call from Unisat and has put the webpage in the chat. So thank you, Lars, for that. Back to you, Chris.
Back to you, Joanna.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joseph, for coming in. And Lars for putting that resource there. If there's interest to connect, we are always so happy to connect anyone with everyone. Chris, I want to take one last question and then maybe come to you for like key takeaways. And this is a question that I specifically like because it goes back to your willingness to openly share what has worked and what hasn't worked. And also, like you mentioned that there were a lot of partners that you worked with. And just a general question, what was most challenging about working in a crisis in these multi-stakeholder partnerships with so many different interests, et cetera, competing potentially with each other?
Multifaceted, and that could be a really expansive question. Look, I think one of the things that UNHCR does really, really well is it, as an organization, it invests really heavily in its legal affairs team, and they're really well set up to bring in new, I don't want to say non-traditional partners because I don't think that helps us out as a kind of a categorization, but in bringing in partners that UNHCR wasn't set up to bring in, and certainly when I was back in UNHCR, we were able to form partnerships with the UK Meteorological Office, with Global Pulse, and with a whole diversity of partnerships, including civil society partners, and those partnerships still exist. One thing that I found in this crisis is really a big reminder that it's the prosaic spaces of the bureaucracy that enable and can really empower us to kind of reach for the stars and to kind of form broader partnerships, and I'm really humbled by the work that's carried out by anybody working on partnerships, because it really unlocks not only data sets and products and services, but really the expertise of different actors, including from what we often refer to as this homogenous lump, the private sector. But secondly, I think when we look within the UN, we still there's a lot more that we can do to kind of work across mandates, and the starting point for me is, whether naively or myopically or not, is to really concentrate on solving the right problem and investing in understanding what the problem is and the challenges are, so that we can quite agnostically reach across our UN and get like the best brains and kind of approaches to solving those challenges outside of mandates. And when I say mandates, I mean that very broadly, rather than not just referring to specific agency mandates, et cetera, But so the second thing is I think it's upon all of us and others to kind of really push the envelope and really insist that we do work across our different parts of the UN, because I think that's increasingly what we're being encouraged to do from upstairs and by the world. And then I think the third thing is, particularly when it comes to partnerships, is why we form partnerships. One of the most important things is just making sure that our values are aligned to the extent possible, and that expectation management is something that we always do. So one of the things that I like in any partnership that I've been involved in creating is to have the value of transparency front and center, so that we're sharing quite openly what works and what doesn't. Over.
I like it a lot. I wish you told me this a couple of years ago. I think I would have taken that on and done better expectation management at the beginning of some projects. So thanks for that. Walking away from this, Chris, what are the 2-3 things that you really want us to remember? What are the key insights that you think are relevant to colleagues here?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I always bang on about values-based approaches to innovation, and I think that still rings true. I'm not gonna go down a rabbit hole of diversity and inclusion and so on and so forth, but I am going to refer to those kind of what did we learn slides, and you know the first one was really around you know, I think we need to push our managers and others to advocate for investment in teams rather than projects. It really does give you the mental space and the agility to solve what actually needs to be solved, and to kind of really do that through the empathy building with those people who are kind of right at the kind of the coalface of that challenge or that problem. So investing in teams and being able to really drive empathy in kind of solution space. Secondly, it's all of us spending an awful lot more time in understanding our glorious bureaucracy. I think that there's an awful lot of innovation that's required in what is sometimes called back-end processes, but really in terms of you know, this is part of the enabling environment. Like there's a lot of work being done in the business and innovation group on this specifically, and that's a signal of wider changes that we also need to support in kind of not so appealing areas sometimes. Sometimes it's the human resources or admin that really need, or procurement that needs the support in processes rather than like that shiny gadget that a lot of donors really want, and a lot of us kind of fall for producing. And then I think the third thing is those of us who are managers is really investing in, even if we're not the innovators ourselves, in investing in those spaces of creativity. And that's really on us moving forwards from our current position and as we head up the hierarchy, is remembering those enabling environments for innovation. Part of that's just having a space for conversation on a regular basis. You design that into your management, or you decide not to. And then the fourth one is, yeah, there's a whole load of issues around I think around psychological safety and mental health that we need to dig into more as kind of an innovation community. And this crisis kind of highlighted a few signals that I'll certainly be taking into account moving forwards. Over.
Great lessons learned, Chris. Very valuable and applicable, I think, across the range, right? Be it in innovation or in any other function. Certainly lessons learned to take on board. So I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us this morning, standing a good grilling, sharing your insights. It's very rare that colleagues are so willing to openly share what has worked and what hasn't worked, and not be afraid to hide it. So thank you for letting us learn from what you have learned. It is so appreciated. We have put the email address in the chat. We'll share it again in the email later on that we'll send with a recording to this webinar. If you want to get in touch with the team, if you want to collaborate, if you want to know more about their work, drop them an email and they'll get back to you. And Chris, we're so excited to see where the next phase of this experiment is going. Best of luck with that.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Wishing everyone a good day. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.